Have you thought about pre-planning your funeral? I know I haven't, and today's conversation with Gina Connolly is going to unpack some conversations that you may want to have with friends and family, but also share some of the experiences she's had in 25 years in the funeral industry, from the crazy to, but also the sweet. So sit back, enjoy this conversation with Gina, and I know you're going to take loads from it. Gina, it's so good to have you on the couch after our first coffee a couple of weeks ago, and here we are. So welcome to the Good Grief Lounge.
Thank you, Ryan. It's so lovely to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
I'm excited about this conversation. We could have chatted for hours over coffee. We had things to do, you had meetings, we had things to go to.
Yep.
So now's the time, and I want to get stuck into this conversation. You've been in the funeral industry for 24, going on 25 years.
Yes.
That's you've seen a lot. You've experienced best, the worst, and everything in between in the funeral space. Today, what I really want to do is pull from your genius, because I think our listeners currently grieving, they've probably just gone through a funeral or the last couple of years. But what I know and what you know is that we don't just experience one funeral in life. There are others, and that's part of the nature of life and death.
Yes.
You know that better than anybody.
I do.
So what I'd love to do is just hear what got you into the funeral industry, just to set people up for this conversation 24 years ago, and what made you say yes?
Okay. Well, I didn't intend to get into the funeral industry, and it was a beautiful origin story with my husband that got me to where I am today, basically.
So we've got him to thank.
Yes. My husband has been in the funeral industry for most of his life. He grew up in it. Mm-hmm. But when I first met him on a beach on Hamilton Island, when I was working there, when I was solo travelling around the world, I actually thought he was a film director. And
so good.
That's one of those stories that we share many, many times, and people love that. And we love it because he asked me out. I thought he was a film director. I asked him what movie he was making, and he told me that I needed my hearing checked because he was actually a funeral director.
And does the story go that you were on a yacht when this happened?
We're on a jet ski on the way to Whitehaven Beach. So the most idyllic situation you could think of.
Got this hunk of a man on this jet ski.
Yeah. I had eyes on him, thinking, funeral director, everyone talking, you're going out with a funeral director. Film director rather. They were excited about the film element.
What's he filming?
Yeah. So I asked him, what's he filming in Mackay? He's like, no, I'm a funeral director. And I wanted to jump off that jet ski. But yeah, we formed a friendship first of all, and then a relationship. And one of the first encounters with Tim and funerals and his business was him asking me to help him with one of the funeral functions.
Wow. What a first date.
Yeah, I know.
Second date.
So, and the first time I stayed with him on the mainland was in the funeral office.
Wow.
I won't tell you where we actually slept, but yeah, it was bizarre for me. It was crazy that I was going out with a funeral director and, being immersed in this world. But when he brought me back to Australia, I didn't intend to get into funerals. I knew I was going to be part of that. I was marrying into a family business. It was always going to be a part of my life. But we had the opportunity to go up to Cairns and run the business up there. So I was fully immersed into it straight away. For the first 2 years of our marriage, we had so many experiences.
What a deep end experience.
Deep end, definitely.
I feel some kind of not similarity, but when I first met Kaylee, we worked out that we both lost a parent each, and it was kind of like, for me, it was kind of like, oh wow, you get it, but we did not know that 5-6 years down the road we'd be here helping people through grief. We didn't see that either, but thankfully we're excited about seeing that into the future.
Yes.
For you, it was like just thrown in and then didn't expect it to be 24 5 years later.
No.
Here we are.
Well, I certainly didn't expect to still be doing it now. In the capacity that I have within the grief space.
Yeah.
And that's something that I've developed myself over the last 5 years because I've seen that need
much.
within the funeral industry, and that's the big gap that I identified, and other people do as well. But I proactively engaging
You've
in
gone
community
after that.
education.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
So I've got to know, and I put it to some of our Good Grief Club members, what do you want to ask Gina on the couch? Because I think your wealth of knowledge and experience, honestly, we could do 3 episodes easily, just to start. But I want to know, and some of our ladies want to know as well,
Yeah.
how did you manage dealing with everybody else's grief
Yes.
and staying, healthy, sane, true to yourself, and continue to show up each day? Like thousands and thousands and thousands of deaths. How did you manage all of their grief and keep yourself in a good place?
Well, I struggled with that at the beginning because I questioned myself, how was I going to cope with that? Like we said, I was thrown in at the deep end, so I just did. I just was there doing what was required of me.
Similar when you go through grief, right? You just do.
You just do because
stuff.
it's almost like you're in shock.
Yes.
I was in that denial state, I think, for a long time, thinking, what am I doing here? What am I doing? I had a business degree, so that element of it, we were still running a business, but as an empath and someone that's really emotional, I struggled to attend those funerals. I would be crying.
I can imagine.
And it was really hard keeping it together. I could feel what was happening in that funeral service. And that is why I started educating myself, because I wanted to learn and to have that true empathy for what people are going through. Not to just let them walk away at the end of our services as a funeral director and then be left with navigating the rest of their grief on their own. I mean, that's been my mission from the get-go, is to still be there. What happens after the funeral?
Yeah. That's a question we get a lot.
Yeah.
Or a real frustration and anger point is like people just disappeared after the funeral. How common is that?
Yeah. The amount of
friendships, family,
hundreds of people would say to me, they get on with their life, and for us, we don't know how to do that.
Left behind.
We feel left behind. We feel isolated in our grief, and even amongst their own close family, even the people living in their own home, because we all know grief is different for everybody. I might use the analogy that it's as unique as our fingerprint. For each person will experience it differently.
Totally.
And that's hard to take. It's really hard to hear a family that have, got to the point of conflict with each other because of the different ways that they grieve.
And that's where the education comes in. How often do we say we don't learn these things in school? You don't learn money, and you don't learn grief, and some of these really core elements in life
lessons
that would help us.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, we're not, I wouldn't have been ready to learn about grief if my life was all good and well. I'm like, why would I? It's a very reactive space.
Exactly. And I don't believe in reactive learning. I believe in proactive.
That's not how I went through high school. I was very reactive, but but I totally agree with you. I totally agree.
And as a teacher as well, I spent,
So
12 to 15 years in the classroom with younger children. But I could see them going through their grief. And not just grief because of bereavement, the grief of loss of family members and divorce and basically just the way that their life wasn't the way that they would hope it to be.
Totally.
And that's something that I personally experienced as well as a child.
Sure.
So I had a connection to that, and I believe that the connection is what the children need.
Totally.
And I think there's value in grief education for younger children,
Amen.
Base it on their age level. And their capacity.
Yeah, it's lovely to see some children's books now being written in the space and so forth. Now, funerals have changed a lot over the years.
Yes.
I would love to know what's some of the biggest shifts, maybe the 2 or 3 biggest shifts you've seen in the last 3 decades.
Massive shifts. And post-COVID, even more massive shift. But as a crematorium operator as well, so my husband's family owned 2 crematoriums. And I think a few months ago, we got to 550 cremations in a month.
In 1 month.
A lot of cremations. Now, that's the trend over the years. Cremations have taken over burials.
Why do you think that is?
A lot to do with the way that we live and the separation of communities. I think in Australia, in particular, we're a transient population. There's obviously a lot of immigrants here. There's a lot of people who have family interstate or overseas. And they don't want a burial site because their family isn't going to be able to visit them.
Makes sense.
Where they live now. Repatriation's very expensive as well to go back to their home motherland, where wherever they were born or where they grew up.
It seems like the next logical step.
Cremation.
Okay.
And it's cheaper as well. So there's been an emphasis on
cost of
the
living
budget,
is much
cost
higher.
of living.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
And real estate value, because Gold Coast are struggling to find areas to bury our loved ones because the land prices, per square metre, a burial site is very expensive. So
when you put it like that, it makes so much sense. It makes a lot of sense. Okay, so
really
that's
does.
the biggest shift you've seen. What would be sort of second to that?
Since COVID in particular.
Just over the years, yeah.
Well, this has been the biggest shift, is that people are opting out of the funeral service.
Interesting.
The ceremony, not how we perceive a traditional funeral, because traditional funerals have already progressed and evolved over the years, over the last few decades. We look at personalized ceremonies now, and I've got many examples of
I want to ask you some of those.
Ceremonies. They're not, the traditional morbid set agenda kind of services, but what people have been doing recently is opting for the cremation only, and that's at the expense of having a formal ceremony where people who knew that person that's passed away all gather, they connect, and they can offer support for each other. That is the value of the funeral service in my mind, and the mind of lots of people.
And it's a rite of passage as well. It's a ritual that's spanned as long as time itself and human existence.
And it continues in so many cultures. And that is what I learned the most working in far north Queensland, because the First Nations people there and the Torres Strait Islanders, each community had their own way of honouring their loved ones.
I bet, yeah.
And we did a Hindu funeral in Cairns, for example, and we honoured their traditions. And most funeral directors around Australia can honour the tradition to some degree. They'll do the best they can. That's what they're there for.
Yeah.
That's what they specialise in, is undertaking parts of a service that you can't do for yourself.
So that leads me to my next question then, is what would be a common misconception that many people have of what the funeral director is or does?
Misconception is that they take total control is one of them, because a lot of families these days in particular want to personalise it. They want to have something to do with it, or they just want nothing to do with it altogether.
Got it.
There's two sides there. However, they don't know enough about what a funeral director does to ask the questions in the first place. We don't know what we don't know.
Yep.
So that's why the education is really valuable. We need to, I think, reframe death literacy and talk about what happens next after death, talk about what it is and the need for that funeral director who is a professional like any other professional that we trust.
An accountant or any of the professionals, they've got a skill set.
Yeah.
Totally.
Okay. So we put our trust and faith into that profession, And of course, like any other profession, there are some awful stories out there with every profession
Sure.
in the land.
But people like keeping their jobs and their professions, so it's in their best interest to present
Yes.
the best possible scenario for a family.
Yeah, but let's talk about the profession itself. Not many people would want to or could do that.
Totally.
Again, like I said, my origin story, I didn't want to be
fell
involved
into
in it.
Yes.
I fell into it, but I grew with it, and I grew to value what the funeral served in the community. And to me, it's about the people that are left behind, the loved ones, and about making sure that they form those connections and they have that support around them.
Totally.
Yeah,
okay, so biggest misconception is that a funeral director would just take control, but for the most part, not the case.
And he can take control if that's what you need.
Sure.
That's the thing. He's there to undertake whatever you need of him.
Okay.
Yeah. Or her.
Of course.
I say him.
You're allowed.
I'm doing it myself.
You're allowed
I'm
to.
doing it myself. Of course.
You can.
Anybody.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. What would be the thing that you've seen most people get wrong in planning their own like not their own but their family's funeral? What's the biggest thing they'd get wrong planning a funeral?
Not having the conversations before. Planning a funeral, even if the family think they know what their loved one would have wanted, it might have been a very vague conversation that they had in the past. It might be something that's actually really detailed, but a lot of the time certain family members will then get involved and have other ideas, and that's where potential conflict starts and the communication breaks down. And that's one of the saddest things to see, actually, being in the funeral industry, is seeing the repercussions of that lack of communication.
Totally.
Because we don't want to talk about it, do we?
Nope.
Nobody
That's
does.
why we're talking about it, right? That's why we're talking about it.
It's not morbid to me. Talking about death and thinking about death and being immersed in it and seeing it and knowing it's existing around me every day just makes me value the life more that we have.
It's so good to hear you say that. Talking about death, which is a natural part of life, makes me value the life that is still around me. That's amazing.
Definitely. I mean, how could it not?
Totally. And as we know, it takes time to get to that place. Obviously in the depths and the darkness of your immediate grief, it's very hard to see out of that hole.
Of course.
But we were talking about it off air, like getting eventually to that, finding that. And that's why it's surrounding yourself with the right people, the right education that speak hope and a future over your story.
Yes.
There is days ahead where you can find gratitude. You can see the glimmers of hope once again and find meaning. So, that's really helpful. That's really helpful to know. I would like to know.
What do you want to know?
I would like to know a couple of the memorable and maybe wild stories that you've come across, or unique stories in the industry.
Well, amongst the family, there's thousands of them. But the ones that come to mind, the ones where you just can't believe that happened.
Hit me.
I'll tell you a crazy one first. And this was my husband, and this was sort of in the interim. I'd gone back to the UK, and he had a funeral at a bikie club in Mackay, and he had asked that when he died, that his tattoos be preserved. So his body was covered in tattoos, and on his back, I think it was a large eagle.
Sure.
And so the family asked Tim, as the funeral director, can you preserve those tattoos for us? And so, as I said before, a funeral director, a good funeral director, will find out what they can do for the family.
Possible.
That's what their job is.
I've
Within
got
reason,
shivers.
that's legal. Okay?
Yeah.
Because we've had a lot of questions asked of us about doing things that aren't legal, and we're there to find out whether we can do, whether we can honour the wishes of the family.
Sure.
So he found out that, yes, indeed, he could do this. So somebody akin to a taxidermist in the facility in Mackay, removed the tattoos off the back of this gentleman, had them tanned and then framed, and they now still exist somewhere in a public house, in a pub, west of Mackay.
Well, you've given a few Easter eggs away there. Okay.
Yeah.
I had goosebumps as you were sharing that.
Well,
because I've got tattoos and it was painful enough getting them done.
Yes.
It's not laser removal. This is like skin, a layer of skin being removed in one piece and preserved.
Yeah.
That is...
And of course, the gentleman had passed away, but that was his dying wish.
Sure.
You know, he had gone through... They meant something to him.
Totally.
Those tattoos, for most people, have deep meaning. And that was a way for his family to preserve a part of him.
And remember him and honour him.
And remember and honour him. And it was such an unbelievable story. It was actually on Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Is that right?
So if your listeners
Ripley's is international.
I tried for years to try and find out that, where that clip was, and they take it off and then they put it back on.
Sure.
I do have the clip available, but it's it's
How
an interesting...
That's very fascinating.
...part of what Tim did.
Look, I'm looking at my arms and I'm kind of like, no, I don't... They all mean something deeply to me, but
they'll go with you.
They'll go with me, these ones.
They'll go with you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if that's burial or cremation,
but maybe a good thing to do for your family is to take pictures of those and to write what the meaning of them
and the story behind them
for you.
That's a great idea.
And that's a legacy piece for people, isn't it? Because that's what I advocate, is that you create those legacies for the people.
And do it before.
Yeah, and do it before.
Okay,
that's one of those crazy ones.
That is a crazy one.
Have we got time for a really beautiful one?
Yeah.
So this was in Mackay, and a family couldn't decide on a photograph of their loved one.
Sure.
To put into the order of service in the church.
Oh, that is a very tough decision. How do you summarise a life in one photo for this booklet?
Exactly. Yeah. And they couldn't come to a decision. So it got to the day before, and they still hadn't produced a photograph for Tim and I to put into the order of service. So Tim said, what are we going to do? We can't leave it blank. So he actually chose a picture of a butterfly and put that there. So the day of the funeral, and he's there conducting the funeral conductor. I'm at the back of the church and ushering people into their seats. A butterfly landed on the knee of the wife of the deceased person. Whoa. And Tim saw that, and it, gave him shivers there and then. But not only that, the butterfly then flew, landed on the coffin, and then later on, as they were pall-bearing the coffin out to the hearse outside, whether it's the same butterfly, because I think there was a couple more, because I saw the butterflies at that point following the hearse down the road.
That is incredible.
And butterflies and other signs. Well, I've got another story about pelicans, but we probably don't have time for that. But yeah,
that's amazing. Butterflies mean a lot to many people.
They do.
Denzel Washington says you'll never see a U-Haul following a hearse.
No.
But after this story, you might find butterflies following a hearse. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Whoa.
And just how they stayed along for the journey.
I've honestly got goosebumps.
It gave me chills last night when Tim reminded me of that story, because there's so many stories, and that's a really beautiful one.
Have you ever had a funeral just go completely off the rails?
Yes, unfortunately. We've had situations where we've had to have security.
Wow. Ahead of time? Or
ahead of time.
You knew that, it was quite contentious?
Preempting, obviously having spoken to the family and the conflict that was already established in the organisational stage.
Sure.
We knew that it was prudent that we have some kind of security there. But we've also had funerals for people who we suspect might do certain things after the funeral. For example, do donuts and a bit of speed racing. And we've actually, at one point, we had the Channel 9 helicopters flying overhead because the funeral
drew that much attention.
Drew so much attention and focus with a lot of, these young people who like letting off steam.
Yeah.
And to them, it was a way
of honouring
to honour
That's right.
the person that they love.
Absolutely, I can see
for
that.
what they loved to do while they were still with us. However, for safety purposes around the area, there was police stationed along the road.
Wow.
Because they were all going to the pub afterwards, and we know that the after part of the service is really important as well. The wake, as some people might call it.
Yeah. Would you call it a wake? What do you tend to?
We do, but a reception, after funeral reception.
Sure.
It just depends what the connotations people have with the word wake.
Where you get a ham and cheese sandwich and a little drink.
But it looks different to everybody.
Totally.
It is a celebration. It's coming together, and that's the point we've found, where people share those personal stories with each other in that less formal setting, and they let their guard down. It's not, and they share the stories, and stories that you've probably never even heard of. So wives, daughters, sons, whoever might hear about their close relation, a story that they've never heard of before.
Yep.
And it's something else that they can carry with them and find out and be curious about.
Yeah, I'm reflecting back to sort of my dad's wake back at our home. Everyone came back to our home. People were just cooking, like in our kitchen. I didn't even know where people came from. They were just cooking. There was, Dad was Sri Lankan, so curries and little things. And I can't remember, conversations verbatim, but I remember the people that I sat with, and I remember I had a conversation. I can't believe he was there and she was there, and wow. And they stayed till the very end, and those things really meant a lot in those early moments. So
it's funny how, it's not funny, but how you just said you don't remember necessarily the conversations, but you remember how they made you feel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's such a key thing in life, isn't it?
Yeah.
There is a saying out there that people won't remember what you did for them, but how they made you feel.
Yeah.
So, okay. I'd love to take this. I mean, it already has been practical, but I'd love to get really practical. Maybe we start this conversation, maybe it's just the starting piece for our Good Grief audience to start thinking, wow, okay, I'm still working through my grief currently, whether that was so recent or it's years ago, etc. But also, how can I be better prepared moving forward for maybe I've lost a parent, maybe it's my next parent, or maybe it's there's going to be more loss. So I'd love to know when someone is, or a family is overwhelmed and don't know where to start.
Yes.
What's square one that you'd say this is a really good spot to begin?
Okay, well, being open to communication and asking questions, being curious. They might be challenging conversations to have, but not talking about it is more challenging.
Sure.
I always used to say about children, what they don't understand, they'll make up in their head anyway, in their imagination. And a lot of the times it's worse than it actually is in reality.
Would there be a couple of questions that you'd recommend? Like, what's a good opening question to this conversation?
Well, I've always found attaching it to something that you've done or thought about yourself. And then, for example, I heard about this podcast today talking about, the importance of pre-planning and having those conversations before about your funeral. Have you thought about the way that you want your life honoured?
That's so good and so meta right here that someone could actually say, I heard this podcast that Gina was talking about pre-planning. And have you thought about that since mum or dad died, or since, Because
even when people know that the end is imminent for a loved one, when people they're already experiencing anticipatory grief. They might not even realise that. They are so busy doing and looking after and caring, they're not observing their own grief for the main part. And that's where they're struggling. And I think that by understanding the complexities and the intricacies of grief, you will give yourself more grace in grief. that's what my learnings have, have led me to believe and understand, and it works for me, and I know it's worked for many other people.
So good.
Because that feeling of knowing that you've done the right thing to honor somebody is a relief to a lot of people, because what seems to happen is people start questioning themselves. Did I do what my mum or dad wanted, for?
So it's confidence that you're talking about here in honouring that person.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is just that.
Because we don't like uncertainty as humans, and to be uncertain of, did I get it right or wrong, or I didn't ask them, I didn't know. Man, that's a yucky space to be in.
It is, because the feeling that you'll carry with you, not knowing, not asking. I mean, that's one of the key sort of takeaways from end of life, is a lot of people who are the dying people say, I wished I had the opportunity. They're thinking about the regrets of the things they didn't do, not what they did do.
Sure.
And that's why communication is so important. Yeah.
We didn't pre-plan anything with my dad. It was a sudden passing.
Yeah.
Kaylee's mum was a 7-year cancer battle, so very different. They got to have those conversations about even like future wishes for her mum and so forth. And so we didn't. And so you sort of scramble together. What did he love? So you just give it your best shot in that scenario. Would have been great to talk about that, and it's a conversation that I want to take to my mum as well. And for me, it's not just the oldest dies. That's not the way life works. And so I need to have that conversation, and my wife as well. But I also think that if you haven't had the conversation, to give yourself grace to. That's my story. We didn't have the conversation. But just knowing that we did everything possible in the short. It's a short window of funeral to honour them, but I think also the honouring continues after that. We talk about that a lot. So it's not just this one shot at getting it right.
Definitely not.
You can work on it, and you can grow in that ability and the skill, and to then go, oh well, there's actually way more. How could we ever just honour them in 90 minutes?
No,
it's not possible.
You can't.
It's not possible.
And that's why, like I said before, there's that value in the coming together after the funeral as well.
Because it continues. It almost starts. It almost starts.
It's like the first step.
Yeah.
Let's just say, a lot of people talk about closure and things like that. Oh, you need to have the funeral for closure. I don't think it's about closing. I think it's about the beginning. It's opening, actually.
That's great.
It's opening yourself to that path that you don't want to take, but you're on it.
Because grief is now attached at the hip.
Definitely.
With us
forever. It'll come with you.
That's right.
Where, it'll stay with you. And, I don't prescribe to time heals all wounds.
No, such a lie.
I really fundamentally believe that you'll carry that grief with you, and your life will expand around that grief, and it might just not touch the sides as much as it used to when time moves forward. But more than anybody, the milestone events, it stings just as much, and sometimes a little bit more.
Totally. The question is, what do we do with the grief that we now have in our lives? And so I like that idea that we're almost, once the funeral takes place and we go to the reception or the gathering after, it's almost like first base, where it's like, all right, this is now opened up, and it's not a closure. We can retrain and educate ourselves. It's not about closure. It's about opening. I like that.
Some people believe and have said to me, it's the smallest part of acceptance. Having that funeral ceremony is where they can tangibly see their loved one in all of those representations of what they think about death and what comes next. Those, the representations, the coffin and the cemetery and the service and whatever else it looks like. But again, it's the closure of that, and then it is moving into the first step of what do we do with our grief now? How do we move through our grief? That's why it's really important, I believe, to have
the
that's
funeral.
Whatever a funeral means to you.
That's right.
I think we attach the word to the old traditional service
in a
of funeral,
church,
but it's changed so much.
Totally.
You can
Just like weddings,
outside.
just like weddings.
It's like
have
weddings.
changed.
Look how
and
people
births
get weddings.
and
Yes,
lots of things have changed.
And we plan for all those, don't we?
That's right.
But we don't plan for the one thing that we're
Hopefully
all going to experience.
Some people surprise us.
Of course,
we're married,
us.
and you're like, guys, it would have been great to celebrate that with you.
There's a certain amount of planning in it.
Yeah, that's true.
There is a certain amount. There has to be. My daughter's a wedding coordinator, so
she
went the other way.
Yeah, there you go.
She went into the weddings, and
she went for champagne, and you guys went for the flowers.
But
What are some of the biggest hidden costs in funerals that people should be aware of?
Well, the hidden costs, a lot of it is to do with the administration. And the hidden costs are not so hidden, but the things on top of the funeral service that you choose to have.
Right.
And that is dependent on your what you want, what your circumstance. And so that's why there's an option for everybody there. A lot of people have to opt just for the cremation only because they have that fiscal concern. However, you can always negotiate with a funeral company.
Good to know.
And also pre-planning is another reason why money shouldn't be an issue.
Sure.
You can, pay and plan now and then forget about it.
That's so good.
And
I think you mentioned to us sort of over coffee that there are some things that are added into packages that aren't necessarily needed all of the time.
Sometimes.
Not what you guys I know work very integral with.
Not anymore
customers.
In the Australian industry because what's happened recently, which is wonderful, because the Australian funeral industry isn't regulated the same way as it is overseas, particularly in the UK, which I'm sure that the listeners have detected. I've got that Pommy accent there. But the lack of certain structures have meant that certain funeral companies can give you a package price, and obviously at need, when somebody is organising a funeral, they're not going to look at every single intricacy of that.
Yeah.
There are things that you could take out and say, well, I don't need this in the package, I don't need that, but again, they're just selling that package. So what's happened in the industry is that prices need to be absolutely transparent now. You have to disclose every single. So make sure it's not something that you want to do, though, is it? When you are busy trying to just get through these days after one of the worst days of your life, you're not wanting to do that. So.
And honestly, it's like any service that you pay for or product. Even at a cafe, when you go 2 coffees and they say $15 and you go, well, where's that? Well, they go, well, it's a Sunday, it's a holiday, there's credit card fees. Oh, you got different. And you're like, but no one, where you sit down, you go, how is that $15? So no one likes sticker shock.
No.
And so I think pre-planning is going to help that.
Definitely.
But then also maybe having an ally that's going to help you.
Yes.
During that, we were very grateful. We had friends that helped us through that could think clearly when we weren't.
Yes.
But yeah, I'm glad that it's now regulated to the point where the line items
it is very
listed.
transparent, and there shouldn't be a single question that you can't ask the funeral director.
Awesome.
They will disclose to you where your loved one is being cremated, what all of the costs are.
So good.
And somebody like myself who wants to educate people about that, ask me the question and I'll find the answer if I don't already know it.
Where were you 13 years ago in our life? You're amazing. All right, I want to talk about don't answer that question. You were up north and we were down here, but I want to talk about managing family emotions and expectations because we've sort of touched on it already. It's a very heightened state that everybody's in. You've already shared a couple of things, but how do you handle like if a family here is planning a funeral, how do you handle those things when they get tense?
When they get tense.
Yes, so there's already some conflict of, it shouldn't be that photo or that song or...
Yes. We need to give them time as much as we can and the space. again, to communicate. Sometimes just a different setting helps.
That's great.
It's a heightened situation. It's walking into a funeral arrangement room, even as, again, getting chills, even as somebody helping that family. It's so hard to sit down and do the paperwork.
You would have seen it on their face the moment they walk in.
When it's been personal to me, when I've been overseas to help my mum actually organise her partner's funeral, even just thinking about it now, it's just so hard being on the other side, to walk in there and then have to go through all these mundane forms and, answering these questions that when you're in that fog of grief there, that you can't even recall that information. And that's why I really advocate for writing down information beforehand, and being as prepared as you possibly can be before you go in there, because it's that feeling of not knowing, or somebody saying, the wrong thing in your point of view, that gets you back up. Because remember about that anger part of grief, that is serving you as well. You're getting angry because you're looking across the table and thinking, why do you not know that? And we've had that. We've seen people having physical fights in the conference room, in the arrangement room, as you would call it.
Not with you guys, with each other.
No, and they do, use us as a punching bag sometimes. But in the profession, I'm hoping that everybody gets this training in the initial stages. We have to understand, we have to be empathetic enough to realise that it's not us, it's not about us, it's about what they're going through.
So good.
And how hard it is for them to communicate. And every time now, and this is what being in the funeral industry taught me, and age and maturity and learning as well, of course, but what's behind the behaviour? It's not hard to understand what's behind the behaviour of somebody that's acting up. Or acting out of character. We don't know their character, but the people standing across the table, are shocked by it sometimes.
And after all the conversations that I've had with my psychologist and the things that he's taught inside of our Good Grief Club as well, what I would dare say the answer comes to is love. They're acting, ultimately, if you come down a couple of layers, they're angry and they're upset at someone for saying something because they love the person they've lost so much, that it means something deeply to them, and they want to get it right, so much so that it causes I'm right, you're wrong type scenarios. And so, but that's in the moment, it's hard to have that conversation, but
it is.
Everybody's here because they love John, who died. And
we need to be real about the situation. There are sometimes people in the room that don't really love that person, not in the same way as the other people. Or we could have family that are in that room that are organising the funeral of a mother or a father or a brother, whoever it may be, and they've had no connection with them for a long time.
Or it was a bad connection, a really bad upbringing.
And what there's that feeling there's
resentment and hurt, and
it's a lot of things. It can be guilt, but a lot of the time it's what if it's the we can call that the bargaining stage. I don't prescribe to those 5 stages of grief by any means, but they're good key words to come back to.
Definitely.
To explain a lot of those emotions that are happening. And we're just overwhelmed with thinking what's going on here, and what are we doing? And
once again,
that's life.
That's life, and none of us were trained for it. We're just
No.
thrown in the mix and taught, you got to sink or swim essentially.
Yeah.
What advice then would you have? And they're kind of similar questions here, but someone who's wanting to really honor their family member, but there is just those conflicts or those tricky family dynamics. How do you still enable everyone to share in bringing something to the table of honor?
Yes.
Without having a 8-hour service?
Exactly. Sometimes it's near on impossible to do, we never can please everybody, can we? Really?
It's good to know.
We can't. The people in the room are going to have things to say as well. We need to honour the person that we loved and the relationship that our relationship is our relationship with that person, and we can honour that ourselves moving forward. So compromise is necessary a lot of the time in the actual funeral service, but that does not mean that you can't do something more and continue to honour that person's life and to commemorate, celebrate, and move forward in your way.
Sure.
And a lot of families do that, because a lot of families don't want the funeral service that's been organised by, we've got a lot of blended families, let's face it, as well,
absolutely.
So we've got a lot of people who have multiple weddings. We've got a lot of people who have multiple birthday events. And we also have people who have multiple celebrations of life as well.
Very interesting.
It's like anything else in life to do with relationships. And when we love somebody and care for somebody, we're never going to do it in exactly the same way as other people.
I'd never thought about that. Multiple celebrations of life or funerals. Yeah.
And they don't have to be the formal sense.
Totally.
But if that means you want to keep a part of the cremated remains, for example, and you take them to the special place that you had together, and a lot of people do that. In fact, Tim and I have just organised our new funeral plans.
Right.
They've been amended a little bit.
So it's like updating your will almost. You're updating as you grow and change and have new ideas.
Yeah.
You update your funeral plans.
If you're pre-planning, it can be a living document. It can change.
Yeah.
And the important thing there is when it changes, to make sure that you communicate that change with the people that you love. To make sure that they understand that as well.
That's
But
so good.
if it's written down, it's not ambiguous. And ambiguity is one of the major concerns that people have. I think he said that he wanted to be cremated, but I'm not sure.
Yes.
And that's where that feeling of, have I done the right thing by him?
Can you imagine having a one-page document that says,
yes,
this would be the song I'd love to be, play as I'm leaving the church. This would be what I'd love everyone to wear. This would be some of my favorite memories in life that I'd love you to talk about. Imagine, and then going, wow, they said all of this. Okay, well, and everyone gets to be a part of bringing those elements to life. Everyone's got a shared focus. And then afterwards you say, wow, did we get it right? Of course, because that's what they wanted. What a great place to land.
There are so many examples of that. Again, we don't have the time, but the way that the families, including the person that's passed away, even if they've not had a life-limiting illness, but they've been mindful and wanted to organise that beforehand. They've been part of it, and it feels that they're a part of it. You really feel...
You feel it on the day.
You feel it on the day. They've got their touch. A lot of people will leave their favourite drink on every seat for the people to go away with. One funeral that somebody told me about recently is all of their Lego was put on display, because
we're talking.
He was an avid, he had a big collection of Lego.
That's incredible.
And everybody got to take
some Lego.
One of his creations.
That is awesome.
Now, how's that? How's the special connection then that you have with that person?
Don't tell Kaylee, that's going to the top of my list. All right, the Lego collection's going to be that's so creative. And really special. And I think that's what comes out of having the conversation with someone before they pass. I think that's I think we might land it there, because I was going to ask you about a meaningful or comforting, one of the most meaningful, comforting, but I think that story there just leaves the door open here for our audience to take this conversation away and go, maybe you're not a Lego fan. Hey, we'll pray for you. But maybe there's something else in your world that you want to start thinking about incorporating, and it's not morbid, into the celebration of your life when that time comes. None of us are leaving this earth, alive. And so we'll leave it on Lego. Gina, this has been
Oh.
incredible. We'll get you
Thank
back
you.
for round 2 because
So many stories.
you're amazing. And you've got a few things in the works at the moment that we're excited for as well. So thanks for joining us. And
Thank you.
would there be any final parting words or like
Oh,
piece that you'd like to share with everybody?
I don't want to tie it up in a bow because I want to leave it
So
open
good.
again. I
Yeah.
don't want to close it.
It's been a bit of a thread
It's not about
in this
closure. It's about, how we move forward. But yeah, that's, if we can take anything away, it is about that. It's about forming those connections with people as best as you can about something that is going to happen to all of us.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Gina as much as I did. And if you did, what we would ask is if you could just rate the podcast. That helps us reach more people that are going through grief just like you and I, and so that we can bring more guests with skill sets and experience like Gina as well. Until next time, big love from Kaylee, myself, and our nearly 11-month-old Nazare. Bye for now.